I had the responsibility of doing research last year to try to come up with a solution for dealing with a pretty bad situation of knotweed up at the community garden. And in researching it, the thing that kept coming up was the bad word of glyphosate, which I know. And so when Peggy and Amy and I were talking, I mean, just everything I learned from it, we reached out to conservation committees, we reached out to pretty much every planning board in the area, we reached out to municipalities, institutions, and what we found, which stunned us, was that it's used pervasively. We certainly know that, as someone said before, homeowners use glyphosate in the form of Roundup or whichever other pesticides, and they're probably the most dangerous with it. As Vivian said, Americans tend to think that if a little is good, more is better. But we also understand in talking with people that for many of you at an institutional and municipal level, glyphosate can be a workhorse used in the proper way. And so we wanted to meet you all where you are and absolutely acknowledge that we understand the decisions that you make for land care treatment can be challenging. As Rob said, even decisions that we make around what is best for pollinators and how well we know pollinators is challenging and not black and white at all, but 1,000 shades of gray. So we put together a panel that, without PowerPoint presentations, they're each going to take 5 minutes and tell you about themselves. And then we hope that you'll have questions and that we can engage in conversations about how we use glyphosate, how can we use it better, how can we look at it now, since you're here today, from a pollinator perspective, and what that might mean.
I'm Andrew Morrison. I'm a project manager for Land Stewardship Incorporated. We're out of Gill, Massachusetts. And we do restoration services and invasive plant management. And so me personally, I studied forest ecology. I was interested in pursuing a master's and really wanted to know more about the study of restoration ecology. And I started looking at programs that were offered, and I ran into West, they were talking about fire. In the Midwest, they were talking about wetland restoration. And I grew up in the Catskill Mountain region of New York, and I'm wondering, well, what's restoration for the forests that I grew up in, the forests that I studied? And that's really how I got interested and started to understand invasive plant species. So as a company, I would say that we look at some practical considerations. So what's the scope of the invasive plant issue on our landscape? What are the limits of resources that our landscape managers are presented with, both in terms of time and money? And then what's the science available to us as managers to inform what kind of practices we use and what's going to be effective? And so we try to act in a method that finds a balance between these factors and then provides a service that we believe is in the best interest of the landscape. So, and attached to that is a continued process of learning. So we monitor our projects, we do data collection when we can in terms of the budget that's available for a project. So we can learn from our mistakes, we can learn from our successes, and then as a company on all levels, both our seasonal employees as well as those of us who are managers, we do continue that. And this today has been an incredible education opportunity for me. And so it's not just being a panelist, but it's an opportunity to learn more. And then without going really in depth into our process, I would say that at the core of the process is a site evaluation. If we don't know what species we're dealing with, what the density or the distribution is, what are the native plants that are intermixed into that system, then we really can't make good decisions about the proper or best possible methods for control in that scenario. And so that site evaluation really is the foundation that informs our choice around the intensity of the method we use, the method itself, and the timing of that method. So that everything gets built from that point forward. And that includes our choice to use herbicides if we do or not, and then what herbicides are appropriate for the scenario. And glyphosate is an herbicide we use, I would say, rather frequently. The word workhorse, I think, was appropriately termed. So.
I'm Heather Cupo. I own the business Plant Euphoria. I have a degree in landscape architecture from Temple University. That means that my landscape architecture degree was based not in engineering or history, but rather in native plant communities and using their structures and their components as much as possible to built landscapes. I think I'm here because I work on the Housatonic Riverwalk. On the Riverwalk, if anyone is familiar with it, we do not use any chemicals at all. It's a riverine corridor, and it's really a reclamation project. I don't think we can call it even a restoration. There are two portions of it. One is heavily shaded by Norway maples, and the other was a sea of knotweed when we first began. The two pieces that come to mind first that change the way that we do things there is none of us have the background. I gave up my pesticide license 30 years ago when I decided I wanted to have kids. But it's also a riverine environment. The soils are not native soils. They are literally garbage. 200 years of garbage, but garbage nonetheless. So we're not creating or recreating any sort of community that has a reference point. We're building a new community. And we set the parameters of using only Berkshire County native plants, and we have lots of volunteers. We've also had tremendous grant writers. So for us to tackle some of these bigger problems, we've had the resource of human capacity, not so much financial, and we spend endless hours, even now that we have outcompeted many of our problems. The canopy, the trees are too big for us to afford to do anything about, and they would destabilize the very steep and fragile banks. So we have worked for many, many years building a plant community that disallows the infiltration on a large scale by knotweed, but we have lots of invasive plants. We have that sea of knotweed is upstream from us, so we get seed source, we probably get some plant parts and rhizome material during floods, but now that the ground is primarily shaded, we get very few new plants, and what we do get, we can cut and just let lie. I know that I was told when I was in school that knotweed will germinate from a root node, a leaf node. I have never actually seen it happen. I think it can happen in a greenhouse under the right circumstances, but we cut our stems as close to the ground as possible and leave them lie. We probably get to it 3 times a season, realistically. I mean, if it's in our way when we're doing other work, of course we cut them, but we make a concerted effort on the banks. It's not always something that we can have volunteers do because of the erodibility of those banks. So we have interns, and they're cheaper labor, but we make up the difference in labor. Now we're at the point where to use anything, even if we were to, would be so detrimental to what we've established. Like you couldn't spray, you could inject, but you couldn't spray. And the product is not even allowed in the river corridor. So that's probably what I have to say.
Tom Lautzenheiser, regional scientist for Mass Audubon, Central Western Region. Mass Audubon is the largest private landowner in Massachusetts and is the largest conservation organization in New England. We own approximately 35,000 acres of land in the state, and I'm responsible for the ecological management of around 17,000 of those acres west of 495. And covering about 31 different Mass Audubon properties in that region. My main job is to go out on those acres and to find out what the major conservation assets of those properties are, and then to identify the threats to those assets and to think about what we can do to eliminate those threats or make the assets stronger. And one of the major threats that I deal with pretty much on every property, with the exception of maybe one or two, are invasive plants. So the assets that we're trying to protect oftentimes are intact native ecosystems, special natural communities that are like floodplain forest at Arcadia, for example, just downriver here on the mill, or rich mesic forests on the slopes of the Berkshire Highlands and the hill towns. So a lot of forests are things that I think about, and invasive plants certainly are a major threat to the integrity of the forests that I steward. If we're trying to make a decision about using glyphosate or other herbicides on our lands to protect those assets, we do it we use a risk management framework that we have following our, we have an invasive species strategy, which is available on our website, and an invasive species handbook, which outlines natural history traits and control strategies and so forth for many invasive plants. But for me, I look at it as, what is the risk of doing nothing in these places if we are looking at trying to protect or enhance the quality of these natural communities? Because oftentimes we don't have the volunteer labor available or the staff time available to actually take care of all these acres in the way that they maybe should be if we didn't reach for all the tools in the toolbox, which include herbicides. So for me, if I'm looking at hardy kiwi dismantling forests out in Lenox, or bittersweet climbing up my floodplain forest trees at Arcadia, or knotweed along the banks of the mill, glyphosate is a tool in the toolbox, and I'm going to say, what is threatened here if we don't apply this tool? What's the damage to the natural system going to be? And typically what we see is that our forests are being dismantled gradually by invasive plants. So a plant like glossy buckthorn, for example, is just in the shrub layer, maybe dominant in the shrub layer of some of these forests. But if a tree falls down, it's not going to be replaced by other trees. It's going to be that process of succession or gap filling will be interrupted by glossy buckthorn. So ecologically, we may have a forest and a forest canopy now, but in 30, 40, 50 years, whatever, as trees start to come down, we're not going to have a forest anymore. So it's kind of a ghost forest, and I think herbicides are an important tool to be considered in certain places to protect that forest resource and those ecological processes that are so vital for our natural lands.
My perspective, I hinted at it, and have time to go into all the research we've been doing on the effect of exotics on pollinator, plant-pollinator interactions and biodiversity. And I think there's no question that I would argue the number one threat to pollinators and the diversity, pollinator diversity that I was talking about are the exotics. In particular, Oriental bittersweet, the Japanese knotweed, and the multifloral rose. We've been doing a lot of surveys over the last 5 years, and they're clearly having a negative impact, and they can do so in a number of ways. The biggest way is that they're just covering native plants, right? It's just a sea of green. I was working in Chesterfield Gorge which is, I think, close to here. Definitely closer to here than where I live, anyway. You know, did a survey, found some rare bees, and next year the Japanese knotweed moved up. You know, I was shocked at how quickly it was moving up, and just looking across the river and just seeing nothing but green is not a good thing. So I am 100% for the control. That being said, we sort of have to weigh the cost of using chemicals. And if there was a way that we could get, you know, sort of deal with these things without having to use or minimize the use of chemicals, then that's a good thing. Now, I've known one of the study sites did use chemicals. It's 10 years post, and things are getting back. The diversity is coming back. So you know, depending on how you use it, and when you use it, there has to be a strategy involved. You can definitely, you know, long-term see some benefits. Again, as was brought up earlier, it depends on the degree that the invasive is taking over the particular habitat. And I've seen, you know, the benefits of removing it. So I've also seen an individual keep exotics off of about 60 acres in Savoy. So you mentioned Windsor. So I had a study site in Savoy, Cosmo Lavoie. I think he works at Notchview. So I've been working with him. He had the most bee diversity, bumblebee diversity that I've seen. Amy's nursery is another place that I've seen quite a bit of diversity in Heath. But he's actively controlling the invasives, and the benefits of doing so are just tremendous. So I guess it comes down to, you know, what are the strategies available to us, and then how do we develop a strategy that would minimize the impact, the negative impact. And I can see how the chemicals can negatively impact either directly or indirectly. So if you're spraying a herbicide, that means that all of the plants that you know, either butterflies using as a host plant or bees are using as nectar and pollen sources, they're all sort of gone as well. And in agricultural areas where they have Roundup ready plants, you see that, right? They just go in and they blanket spray, and you don't see anything in bloom around. I grew up in an area, and interestingly, that started around 1996, which is when we started to see their wild bee declines. Now, I talked about science, and that was strictly speculation and correlation, which isn't a cause and effect. But anyway, I think, well, what do I think? I think minimizing chemical use is a good thing, but again, I guess it depends on the degree of the problem that you have. And I guess I'll open it up to discussion.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So is Cosmo doing that by hand, or are we
Yes.
Yes.
No, he's
He's
doing
He's
it by
doing it by
hand.
hand.
Yes.
Yes, he is a remarkable individual.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's around 60. It's definitely larger than my 44-acre site.
Does he have buckthorn?
And he has,
We can
Um,
solarize with buckthorn.
so specifically, I mentioned, so he told me he was actively keeping them off by hand, like pulling. And he's got wetland, grassland, old farm. It was like a horse farm or something, but he's got a ton of land, and it was covered with Bombus tricola. It had more Bombus tricola, which was the bumblebee species thought to be gone from the state's perspective, I guess because nobody was looking. He had more on his property than I have seen anywhere, and as well as his Bombus borealis, which was rare but is now hyper abundant. He had tons of native plants in bloom. I went there 3 times, I think, in the summer, and anyway, so it can be done, but again, you have to. It depends on the stages, and I can't speak to treatment strategies because that's not my wheelhouse. But I can say there are benefits, but we have to look at the costs. And so if you're going to spray when things are in bloom, even though it may not, it's just not good to expose things to chemicals, whether it's going to lead to pollinator decline. I don't necessarily think that. I just think that we need to plan. We need to think about not just bees, but we need to think about diversity in general, insects when we're host plants, native plants when we're thinking about strategies. I'll leave it at that.
The first thing to do is to really look at it I mean, with just taking your feelings and saying, oh my God, it's inundated and there's nothing, oh, how could this possibly, going the way that is so easy to go, you don't really know what you're dealing with. What species do you have? What are their life cycles? If you can keep things, even if your first step is just to say, I'm never gonna let any of this stuff bloom. That, preventing a season's worth of seed, you've made a step that, is pretty, a smaller step that has a bigger effect. I still don't think that it necessarily means you're not gonna end up using some chemicals, but there are certain things that effort can make a dramatic difference in. And that is something that a single person, you could go around and cut all the bittersweet vines now in the winter when you're not busy in your garden.
And they're easy to see.
And they're easy to see. And you will slow down their assault. So that's one thing that I would say. I don't know who's next.
Just following up on that, I would also say, from my own experience, that just hand cutting or hand pulling bittersweet is ultimately useless. And if you can keep that up essentially forever, you're golden. But the chances are that you or the person who is stewarding that land eventually is going to move. Maybe the next property owner isn't going to be so conscientious. And all of that time that you spent doing that is basically sunk, in my experience. And I say that from my own land ownership of mowing patches of bittersweet for 10 years, basically, throughout the summer, and thinking that was going to make a difference, and then finding that, it's like I went on vacation, I didn't mow, and then it was like this hydra, growth form of bittersweet that came up. So, that plant in particular is really difficult to control physically, because any little root fragment is going to re-sprout. So, I guess I would just say, you can keep them in check through physical means, but if you're really trying to kind of address the larger problem, I think chemicals are ultimately potentially should be strongly considered.
I wanted to thank Heather for emphasizing the conversation about what do you have, what species do you have, what's the density of that species, because as Tom pointed out, invasives don't all have the same biology and mechanism, and whereas you may get really far with hand control on some of our species like buckthorn and barberry, a species like oriental bittersweet, which is an aggressive root sprouter, some sort of cutting of large vines, which is going to activate the root system to start sending up new vines. There are pros and cons to that. We could keep bittersweet vines out of canopies, which literally causes trees to prematurely die and is damaging that canopy system, and turn it into a low growing plant, which probably has a larger pollinator detriment maybe than the canopy plants. But making those decisions conscientiously and knowing what your goals are for that system. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for a biological control and that's why you're keeping it in check? Are you just preserving the canopy because that's all you have the resources to do in terms of money and time, etc.? So I just want to, we should make those decisions very clearly. And if you think you may turn to herbicides, a cut stem treatment where you're applying concentrated herbicide to the cut stem surface of that oriental bittersweet is going to do a whole lot more good when that vine is large and consolidated and easy to find, and it's going to translocate that herbicide to the root system. If you cut that vine and 3 years down the road when you have this hydra of small vines and you choose to use your herbicides, you may have closed the door on your ability to effectively use a targeted method like a cut stem treatment. So,
Can I
one
just
of-
add, what is that in terms of, I live in wetlands, so how does that impact
I
the
really
wetlands?
need to hire somebody.
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, so the question was, my property is in wetlands. What the town property is in wetlands. What are the implications in wetlands? And there is herbicide labeling around wetlands that a professional licensed applicator is going to know which herbicides are strictly forbidden, which herbicides have any restrictions in their use in wetlands, and which ones have been sort of legally given the green light for usage in wetlands. Now that may differ from your ecological preferences, but it's the legal considerations on that question. I'll pass it there.
So just going back to knowing what you have, it also involves knowing what you want. Do you want to try to eradicate something? Is that really possible? Or do you want to do that in this very specific location because you noticed greater biodiversity? And so the value of that, or the value that you place on that particular place on the earth, is higher than the one that you place on, you know, the one a half mile down the road. So knowing what your goals are, I mean, the basic IPM pyramid or circle, that thought process and using that to guide your decisions will, even if it doesn't help you make a decision, it clarifies what it is that you want, and that helps you make the decision. So, you know, that is something that you can look up online if you're unfamiliar with it.
You may want to define integrated pest.
Integrated pest management is a way of choosing what strategies you're going to use to address a given circumstance. It doesn't have to be a negative circumstance, but it often is, of course. And it changes your thought processes, it clarifies them. It also, as you get closer and closer to using your chemicals, it creates a hierarchy of toxicity often, or a hierarchy of, I'm looking for greater biodiversity. Does that mean just adding greater biodiversity? Does it mean, it'll help with those thought processes. And that's just something that I think can always help.
Just following up on that, once you've set a management goal, that helps you understand whether your goal is actually can succeed or not. So before you cut one vine or do really any management action, it's really important to say, am I committed to success here? And how do you define that? So if it's only going to be, I have the energy or the money or the time to do, one thing. Well, what's that one thing going to be to have the greatest effect? And if it turns out that I want to take care of this patch of knotweed or something, and you only have one thing you can do, you're probably better off not taking on knotweed. Spend your energy doing something else, because you're trying to succeed, and one action is not going to succeed taking out knotweed. So again, that's part of this integrated decision tree, or pest management decision tree. But plan for success, and then make sure you have the resources to achieve success.
I would emphasize the fact that poison ivy is a native plant. We've seen maybe a range expansion or a growth expansion, and there might be lots of possible causes for that. But as a company, we actually don't control poison ivy because it is a native plant species. I talked to an orchard manager once who indicated that because poison ivy is a broadleaf, right, it's not adapted to repetitive mowing. But if you repetitively mow it, it often grows at a very close proximity to the ground. And so he was using a combination of tall growing grasses to sort of force the poison ivy up off the ground, combined with close mowing, repetitive close mowing. But that's a strategy that was indicated. I've never used it myself or couldn't suggest it beyond that. If you don't mind, I wanted to quickly add a point to something Heather and Tom indicated, which was, I think often we get,
Yes, it does work.
okay. People often get concerned when they talk to us about, preventing the very next crop of invasive plant seeds. And what I often remind them, because I think this becomes a point of stress for people, is that in many cases these infestations have been present for 10, 15, 20 years. And if it takes you 1 or 2 years to go through the process of articulating your goals properly, coming up with a plan, finding long-term funding or volunteer sources, that extra 2 years of seeds that are on that landscape are not nearly as important as having a well-articulated plan and a strategy. So don't get stressed about, am I going to stop this year's seed crop, if it means rushing your planning process.
Theoretically, that is a really sound idea, at least from my very limited experience, but using compost tea to accelerate the, accelerate, is that the right word? Or inoculate the wood chips. There used to be a tree company, and they would drum grind their trimmings with all of the tip material as well. When I used that in my gardens, the soils became, I don't know, like
Supercharged.
juicy and delicious. And I had fewer problems. That's just, a limited experience, but as a strategy, if you're interested in it, I think you're going to get results that make you happy. I'm not saying that you can do that everywhere, but the compost tea inoculant of fungus, if you can get your mise en place there. I keep using food things. I think of it that way. I've found that I develop better soils when I incorporate the woody material, even though you can talk about nitrogen being removed from the top layers of the soil with wood chips. I think it's a very temporary situation. Those wood chips start to break down pretty quickly. So yeah.
We'll emphasize early action, right? As we talk about control mechanisms, the longer an infestation is present, no matter what type of cost we want to talk about, whether or not it's herbicide cost, labor cost, any type of cost is going to continually increase the longer that plant is there. So if you can find them early, the costs are low, and the possibility of using a more diverse range of control mechanisms is much higher. Your volunteers are capable of doing more on those small plants. The effort units are lower, et cetera, et cetera. So buckthorn baggies, you can Google that. It was a science project by a young student, I think in the Midwest. They have big common or glossy buckthorn problems out there. The baggie is a black plastic baggie. It's placed over the cut stem of the buckthorn. There's very specific instructions, read them. We've had that method used in several locations. I would say 50-50 success ratio, which is not horrible. The success is higher if the baggie is used absolutely correctly, so it's important that you read the instructions. You're essentially smothering the root collar of that buckthorn plant. And it works much better on single-stemmed individuals rather than plants that have sprouted with multiple stems. So in terms of planning, if you cut a buckthorn, it will come back with multiple stems. So if you are planning on using baggies, do it right the first time. Science indicates that knotweed destabilizes banks because of the growth form of the roots, forms a very concentrated nodule with runner roots. You can look further into that if you're interested. And secondly, whenever I guess I'm ever asked the question about what can I do to my native ecosystem community that will repel invasive plants, and we can make our native ecosystem communities healthier, we can pack native plants into there, etc., and that is a benefit. But if we think that invasive plants got that term without being able to infiltrate our native ecosystem communities, then you're misunderstanding the term invasive. So we can't provide our native plant communities with enough kapow to keep invasives out.
Especially on disturbed river bank.
And the only thing I would add to that, which I don't think anybody will, our water, the way we channelize water creates the very environment that, then we have washouts and raw soil, and who's going to get there first? The knotweed. So thinking about our broader water systems and the way that we have used land is really backing up far enough to begin to address that, perhaps.